Out of the many fighting games Capcom has released over the decades, did you know that there's only been one fighting game that has never seen some sort of console release? Or even a re-release in general? Growing up, the game known as Red Earth, or War-Zard in Japan, was a complete mystery game to me. I was a huge Capcom fan, and I had played literally every fighting game they ever put out, except for this weird random game that I'd only seen in screenshots or forum posts, and arcade releases for the game seem ultra rare outside of Japan. So if you're wondering what's up with this game, let's go ahead and check it out and dive into Capcom's weirdest fighting game ever. Red Earth was Capcom's first release on their shiny new CPS-3 hardware system for arcades. The CPS-3 had big shoes to fill, as it was not only the successor to the aptly named CPS-2 hardware that boasted classics like Super Turbo, Vampire Savior, and Marvel vs. Capcom, but it also needed to compete with the state-of-the-art 3D titles that were coming out at the time like Virtua Fighter 3 and Tekken 3. And because of that, Capcom went all out to show off. Red Earth is a gorgeous game. While Vampire Savior and Third Strike get rightfully discussed when bringing up fighting game sprite work, Red Earth is sadly left out of the equation most of the time. Character designs are so creative, and all of the animations are insanely fluid, and I legitimately believe this is some of Capcom's best work in all aspects. In character design, art direction, and overall aesthetic. It's just so impressive. It feels like a natural progression from Capcom's Dungeons & Dragons games, which has some of my favorite Capcom work ever. And while of course Street Fighter 3 and Capcom's JoJo games would define the CPS-3 hardware in the future, Capcom were truly risky and experimental with their first release on the hardware, because not only was Red Earth a new IP, but it was also not your standard fighting game. So, Red Earth is kinda weird. Straying away from the traditional tournament fighter that Capcom basically created in the 90s, Red Earth is essentially a 1v1 RPG beat-em-up boss rush fighting game, which just means that you pick a character and go through their story, fighting unplayable and unique bosses, all while gaining experience which makes you level up and gain new moves and weapons. As you level up and go through the game, you obtain passwords that allow you to save your character for the next time you play, so you can keep grinding and unlock more. And once your character is beefed up, you can plow through their story again, or even battle another player's character like a standard fighter to see who's better. Control-wise, it's still played like your standard 6-button Capcom fighting game, with light, medium, and heavy punches and kicks, with your typical Hadouken, Shoryuken, and Tatsu motions attack for specials and supers. But there is a twist. There are 6 different elements in the game, those being lightning, ice, wind, fire, meteor, and poison. And different weapons and specials can have different elemental properties, but more importantly, your supers can as well. Supers in Red Earth are tied to an elemental resource that you gain through orbs that are dropped throughout the matches. They each have different effects and can dish out different attacks, and since supers aren't tied to a meter and instead a resource on the stage, it creates an interesting dynamic where screen control applies to more than just hitting your opponent. So, you could probably tell that Capcom's intent with Red Earth wasn't necessarily to make it their next competitive hit like Street Fighter or Darkstalkers. This was a fighting game with story, secrets, and even different endings. So let's talk about the single player content of the game. Red Earth has you pick one of 4 characters living in an alternate version of Earth that hasn't evolved technologically past the Renaissance era, and instead has evolved through magic. But of course, an evil sorcerer has appeared and started messing everything up, and it's your character's job to put a stop to all of that. Our first character is Leo, who is of course a lion man, but he used to be a regular dude who was also king of his country until he was cursed. Now he's gotta kill monsters with the 3 wise men and hopefully find a cure to his curse. Leo is a big dude with bigger hitboxes. He can apply nasty pressure with the sword and mix it up with his command grabs. Next up is Mei Ling, a young martial artist who left her town to compete in a tournament and won first place, only to return to her town burning to the ground. Now she's gotta go punch some monsters. Mei Ling is your fast moving mix-up character who can rack up the stun bar like crazy. Then we have Kenji, a ninja whose shogun has ordered him to stop the monster invaders. He's not the crazy fast character you'd probably expect a ninja to be, but he does have a giant gun, so. And finally, we have Tessa, a sorceress who sensed evil and is out to vanquish it. Tessa's probably the most interesting character gameplay wise. She's a zoner who has way too many options. She's got great buttons, a good DP, and amazing screen control. Plus, she's got probably some of the coolest animations for a fighting game character ever. I love it. And that's it. While Red Earth only has 4 playable characters, there are 8 unplayable bosses with personalities of their own. We have Halzer, the giant dinosaur. Hydron, the trident-bearing snail squid. Congo, the ogre who could go up to bat with Samurai Showdown's Kusaragero. Ravenge, the 3-headed Egyptian-like chimera. The harpy Lavia. Gigi, the Aztec-like stone warrior who showed off that the same character could have different sprites depending on whether they were facing left or right before gilded. The lifeless Knight Blade. And finally, the evil sorcerer behind it all, Sion. Every character's trek through slaying these bosses is unique, as everyone has different weapons they can get, different interactions with the bosses themselves, and different characters exclusive to their story. Bosses have unique, distinct weaknesses to the elements, and as stated before, there are alternate endings for each character depending on choices and other conditions made by the player. Also, did I mention there are fatalities in this game? Capcom made a fighting game where a ninja can rip out a T-Rex's heart, and they didn't port it to anything? That's insane. But let's get down to the real meat of a fighting game, which Red Earth still has even though there's a huge focus on single player content. While fighting game like boss rush beat 'em ups have existed before Red Earth with titles like Monster Maulers and Metamorkester, Red Earth was still the first that actually allowed you to fight another player, as these other games were just co-op runs. How is Red Earth played as an actual 1v1 fighting game against another player? To get the most out of Red Earth, both you and your opponent would play as a max level character, which is a level 32 character. So after you do a quick password on the character select screen once, you battle it out in a game that is much more movement and spacing orientated than I would have originally thought. The stages in Red Earth are huge vertically and horizontally, and characters can move all around that space or fill up that space with big attacks pretty easily. Combos are not long at all, and individual good buttons poking at the opponent are really important, especially because in Red Earth, you can be guard broken pretty easily, which can obviously lead to some big damage. To prevent being guard broken, Red Earth has a unique mechanic called Ultimate Guard, which is a sort of auto parry that will tank attacks and nullify chip for the player, done by pressing a punch and kick of the same strength. Once activated, the player can then counter attack out of Ultimate Guard. But if it whiffs, it will leave the player with a lot of recovery that can be punished. This adds more layers to Red Earth's movement, as Ultimate Guard can only be done on the ground, so while your air movement is so good, you still want to take that chance to jump and potentially have to block and get guard broken and die? These kind of choices are why fighting games are so cool. As I said in the beginning, for the longest time Red Earth has been a very obscure game, and a large part of that has to do with the fact that there has been no ports, and that even emulation for it was not the best for a long time. But thanks to advancements in the scene and FightK2, Red Earth is easily accessible to play now. Community members like Peon2, Melvin is a nice boy, and Ghost Shroom have garnered an English-speaking scene for the game, as they have made introductory content to help players pick up the game, they've put out tech, they've wrote the wiki, ran tournaments, and even maintain a Discord that's active with helpful members so Red Earth can thrive. Probably more than it ever has before. Red Earth's legacy has been pretty weird. Even though it hasn't seen a release outside of the arcades ever, Capcom isn't afraid to reference it. Most famously, or infamously, 4 of the characters were put into Capcom Fighting Jam, which is one of Capcom's most hated fighting game releases ever, that we could probably talk about another time. Interestingly, they didn't just add the 4 main characters into the game, but they added Leo, Kenji, and 2 of the bosses, Halzer and Hydron. which is honestly really sick that they're playable. The game has also been referenced in multiple crossover games, with Tessa being playable in some of them, and Red Earth even has costumes in Street Fighter V, so it's nice to know that at least in some way, this weird little game gets a little love every once in a while. Although there are like a million other Capcom games that need to be ported over to modern systems, that are probably a little more important than Red Earth, I hope this game gets some kind of actual release at some point. And whenever the next Versus game comes out, or if Capcom ever continues the Darkstalkers series, then let's throw some Red Earth characters into it. They'll fit in great. Be sure to check the description for links and resources to start playing Red Earth. Thanks!